In this reflective presentation, I wanted to show you some of the samples that have showed my journey over this course. Over contemporary textile crafts, I have learned so much about the craft of textiles and even understanding what a craft is and how somebody can be a maker, but a maker of a craft. And so I wanted to kind of share some of the samples that I think have sparked really significant discoveries, some samples where I've learned something completely new, and samples where I've really stretched my thinking. So first of all, thinking about my creative process, beginning this photo for me, I took this photo of a selection of my work all laid out, and it really began my thinking into how I see my work, how I group my work, what patterns I look for, what colours I look for, what selections. And it's a photograph I always come back to because I feel there's always some development to be had in it. It's a photograph of drawings, of mark makings, of pictures that I've taken, of some surfaces I've gathered that sparked my whole interest in knitting and creating loops and creating knots. So my first really simple sample that I wanted to share with you that really developed my work using temporary collage was just drawing on laminate. This is so straightforward, and yet I found that even when I just did the most basic, almost really ugly mark making drawing, but when I laid it over the top of something else, it had new life. When I laid it in different positions, it helped me to very quickly decide how I wanted to develop my marks, and I started to see loops appear. I started to see layers, I started to see different dimensions, I started to even think more sculpturally, which I've never done in textiles before. I've always thought about flat surfaces, and even when I was knitting, I was creating flat knits, but then I wanted to twist them and turn them and pull them, and so the laminate for me started that idea of taking something 2D, layering it up and seeing down through the holes, seeing down through the loops, seeing down through the gaps. Another really important discovery from a process point of view over this course is how I've used my sketchbook. At the beginning of the course, I really struggled to use a sketchbook. I was working on loose bits of paper, I was working on anything like bits of wallpaper I could gather together, and whilst I really like the informal style, I needed somewhere that I could develop my ideas, and my ideas weren't flowing. And so I tried different sketchbooks, and I've realised something really simple about myself as a textile student about what kind of sketchbook I like. And so for me, this small A5 sketchbook, as I just flick through it, I mean, it's full of post-its, it's full of photocopies, it's full of materials I've stuck in, full of post-its there, designs, it photographs I've drawn samples as I've made them, and so it's just a really good document of my journey through this course. And I like that it's messy, I like that it's small, I like that I can develop as I go through it. So this has been a huge important part of my process, and how I've developed my ideas going forward. And what I've also then discovered through my sketchbook is about my drawing. I found that my drawing, I'm always been very much about mark making, but over this course I've had so much more confidence in my drawing to actually not worry about what it looked like. To me, the drawing was a process, not the outcome. To me, drawing was very much about diagrams and annotating everything and developing things. It was not about drawing the best version of something. I was using drawing. Here I photocopied them and stuck them back together to create a little bit of a collage, but it's about drawing, using drawing as part of development, as part of my creative process. And how I've also come to the conclusion that how I use drawing is up to me as the maker, and it's about how I see my development going forward. Other samples that have developed my knowledge in this course has been embroidery and weaving. These are just two of my samples that I feel reflect me, but they are also developed a little bit. So for me, weaving was a completely new process. I understood, and I remember from my school days what weaving was, but I didn't feel like I really understood it. And when I started to learn about the vocabulary, the warp, the weft, how I then started to structure a weave together, and how actually I could see how it became a fabric. This is denim and all sorts of unusual materials, kind of, and just bits woven through. But my loom here is actually a macrame net underneath. So, and then from here I could go and weave on my garden gate, and I could see the beginnings of a loom in the vertical lines on my garden gate, and then I could weave through them. So weaving for me was a completely new process that I hadn't really delved into much before. So extending my knowledge and my vocabulary. And similarly, embroidery, here I have a newfound respect for hand stitching. I have grown to love it. I always preferred to go for a machine because I thought it was quicker, it was easier, I could get to the outcome. And actually the process of embroidery for me has been really valuable. And I've been using, what I've really enjoyed and linked it back to my mark making, is using my needle to draw with. And seeing that I could draw the marks that I was drawing in my sketchbook, I could draw them on my fabric. And then I could use my embroidery to join things together. And some of my developed samples later on in knit are where I've got different selections of knitting that are free-formed, and then I've used embroidery to sew them together. And I was really interested in the contrast between the thin joined marks and the thick dense marks. So embroidery, whilst I could hand stitch before, I've really grown to understand how valuable it is, and to see the history and the culture behind embroidery, and how and really I go back to the same point for me in this course. It is not about the outcome for me. I've learned so much about the process. I've learned that embroidery is a process. The culture of embroidery and the story behind embroidery is about creating something where you're putting your handcraft into it. And whilst in the really decorative pieces I looked into, it is definitely about the outcome. But for me, I've learned so much about how I get there and what I use to get there. Finally, the samples that I have gone on to develop, and my construction that I ultimately chose, it was knitting. I knew how to knit before. I had the knowledge of knitting, or I thought I did. And then I've been able to inquire about it and explore it as I've gone through the course. These samples show my critical thinking, show my discoveries, show my inquiries. So even you can just see going from one of my first knit samples to one of the samples in project 9. And I think when I look back at my definition of knitting, I can see it in these samples. I can see that I understand that it's repetitive, but I can see that it's made up of loops. I can see that it is to knit together has stuck with me all through this course. We often say to knit something. I was thinking about skin, and actually thinking about on my thumb, when I cut my thumb and my skin, somebody actually said to me, your skin knits together, it fuses. And then I can see that in this sample, actually to fuse together, to see the loops. And even back in my early knit sample days, I quite often take a knit and all I want to do is pull it apart. I want to pull it and I want to stretch it and I want to see the fusion. I want to see where things knit together. I want to see where my stitches interlock. And so this was the whole inquiry about taking materials, taking unusual materials where the knit allowed them to move. It allowed them to stretch. It allowed it to be dense. It allowed it to create loops. And so for these samples, I feel really show my developing inquiry I really have thought about, what do I want to test? How can I take knitting in a new way? What do I want to develop? What do I want to think about? And I really see myself as a maker, and thinking about what do I want to make? How do I want to take the knowledge that I have and take it in a new direction? So for these are 3 samples that show my development through the knitting process, and how I can really see how I've grown as a student, as a learning student through this. I can really see the learning outcomes in this through the historical aspect of looking at knit, taking knit in a contemporary way, sample making, looking at my creative process, using unusual materials. I can see all of the 4 learning outcomes, but I can see how I've developed and how I've changed, and how I've started thinking in a more curious way, in a more inquiry-based way, wanting to discover something new. So over this course, from the journey, from the beginning of discovering about my personal voice, through adding to my knowledge and finding out how my process develops as a maker in my sketchbook, to actually how I inquire about craft, about process, and how I inquire about the materials and the constructions that I make. I have thoroughly enjoyed this course, and I'm really looking forward to. I don't think I can let go of knit now. I feel like knitting is a part of me, and I am really looking forward to just developing knitting further and seeing what else I can come up with and seeing what else I can create.